So I would just like to welcome all of our attendees and guests, with, of course, a special welcome to WAPOR members and also WAPOR guests. We hope you find this useful, and even hope you might consider joining WAPOR if you enjoy this and other programming. But of course, WAPOR webinars are always free and open to anyone who might be interested. We're so delighted we're able to have such a diverse group of people attending this. I am really, for those who don't know, WAPOR is an international organization. We have official representatives in 117 different countries who conduct public opinion and survey research, and who monitor the conditions and help us stay global and international. And we're just honored today to be able to share one of what I think is the real innovations that's occurred over the last number of years, with consistent comparative cross-national surveys done internationally and on a regional level. And the Afrobarometer is one of these that gives a great voice to people, the ordinary people and citizens of a variety of African nations and places. And in the sort of pre-meeting, I was just saying how many students over the years I've had who study politics globally or in other places have made use of this survey to help understand and contextualize data. So we're really honored and delighted to be joined by Professor Boniface Dulani, who is a professor at the University of Malawi and also is the director of surveys for Afrobarometer. And we apologize for not being able to show his face. I have seen him; he is here. But one of the things that sometimes happens with these global courses and presentations is we have bandwidth issues different places. So we're being judicious on sharing video so that we can get the voice and see the slides. I also just am joined and really want to thank Ali Ngesa, who is a member of WAPOR and a member of the WAPOR Education Committee. And because Ali's really the person who has been doing the recruiting and coordinating with Professor Dulani. So Ali is going to be asking some questions later and providing some context, but just want to give credit where credit is due. This is a product of WAPOR and of the Education Committee, but really the Education Committee is a group of people, and we couldn't do these things without people taking different roles. So now I would really like to hand this over to Dr. and Professor Boniface Dulani to share with us the Afrobarometer. Bonnie?
Thank you so much, and thank you to WAPOR for leading this invitation for us from Afrobarometer to share this incredible journey that we've had over the last 25 years. And I'd like to start by wishing a good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the people who have joined us, depending on which part of the world you are coming from. I think this is indeed a historic year for us as Afrobarometer, as we mark, I think, the first, the quarter century of our existence from 1999 to today. So I will be sharing with you. Sorry, I think my screen is kind of frozen. This is always the problem with technology. So I will be sharing with you, I think, just the Afrobarometer journey, just giving, I think, a very brief overview who we are as Afrobarometer and what motivated, I think, the decision to start Afrobarometer. And then I'll give you just some very briefly and some key milestones that the Afrobarometer has had in our 25 years journey, and so just talk briefly about the data as a source for effective policy making. I think We know, of course, Afrobarometer data are used mostly by academics, students, faculty members the world over. But as Afrobarometer, we are so very keen to ensure that the data are used and taken up by policymakers. We will also highlight some of the challenges of doing surveys on such a diverse continent. And I'm glad to see, I think in the list of participants, I'm joined by some colleagues from Afrobarometer, so maybe they also help me to answer some of the questions, because I see we have people from, again, across the African continent that might even give more insights into some of these challenges that we face. But as I was also saying in the pre-webinar meeting, I'm sure that the people that we have attending today have their own experiences with challenges and maybe also solutions to some of the challenges, and give us suggestions on how we can address some of these challenges. I'll close the discussion with just some brief discussion on some of the innovations that we are undertaking as Afrobarometer as we embark on, I think, in the next 25 years of our journey. I'd like to start, I think, by just highlighting why I think we do have Afrobarometer and what really motivated some of our colleagues who founded Afrobarometer. I think for a long time, there were, we would have experts, political leaders, academics, donors, media personnel, you name them, who claimed to have knowledge and opinions about Africa without necessarily asking the real, what I would consider to be the real experts, the ordinary Africans themselves. So while there's a lot of value to the data that we get from these professionals, I think that information, that data lacks the nuanced understanding of the values, understanding, and the thinking of African citizens. So the solution then was to try and to embark on this journey where we would conduct this, do this research, applying the same rigorous standards that are utilized the world over, to apply them and design a research program that would then collect this kind of data on the African continent. Of course, it was quite a challenge, but the goals, the benefits from doing this were that we would now begin to also hear the voices of ordinary African citizens speaking out on issues that are very dear to them on a range of issues. So in 1999, three eminent African scholars, Professor Jima Boadi, who was then at the University of Ghana, Legon, Professor Bob Mattis, who was at the University of Cape Town, and Professor Michael Bratton, who was at Michigan State University. They were all doing their own survey work in different parts of Africa. And when they got together, they realized that we are actually doing something similar, but doing it in different parts of the African continent. Then they got together and decided to set up Afrobarometer with the goal of giving African citizens a voice in policy making, and also to give African citizens really a platform to amplify their concerns, aspirations, as well as hopes on a range of topics from governance, economics, and livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So this really gave the birth of Afrobarometer in 1999, and that journey started with initially 12 countries in Southern Africa and a few in East Africa as well as West Africa. But since then, as Afrobarometer, we have expanded our coverage to become a truly Pan-African network, covering between 75 and 80% of the population of Africa. You have the map there that shows you the countries where we are working, and we are also constantly looking at new countries and exploring opportunities and avenues for us to go and work in these countries. Of course, we are guided by a number of criteria in selecting, I think, our countries. Firstly, we look for availability of recent census data for drawing samples. We also look for availability of potential availability of research organizations that we can work with, that we can build their capacity, and then they can collect the data on our behalf. But we also looking at how open a particular country is, because we do want when we ask citizens, we want them really to tell us what they truly believe. So we have been expanding. I think since 2022, we have expanded into Mauritania, in Congo, Brazzaville, and I think as we speak, we are also exploring the possibility of adding Comoros and Chad into our family of countries. As you know, since we started in 1999, we've conducted a total of 259 surveys in up to 39 countries, with sample sizes varying from 1,200 to as many as, I think, 3,200, although our default sample size tends to be 1,200. Cumulatively, over the years, we've conducted more than 388,000 interviews in more than 100 languages. I'll come back to, I think, to this issue of languages, later on in my presentation. But we are also mindful as Afrobarometer that just collecting data is not enough. So we also do a lot of analysis and hold, we've held hundreds of briefings to various stakeholders from civil society, media, political leaders, as well as senior government officials, as well as development partners in all the countries where we operate. We also, there have been, so many publications done by Afrobarometer, as well as those that have been published by people outside Afrobarometer, but that have been making use of the data. And Afrobarometer data is a public good, so all our data are available on our website, free of charge and at no cost. We also do provide on our website, I think, capacity for people to do their own basic analysis, online analysis, without necessarily requiring the use of any statistical data software. And this data goes back all the way to 1999, providing, I think, the kind of time series data that people can use to track political opinion and attitude, and opinion and attitudes, as well as perceptions on the many issues that we address in our surveys. In terms of the milestones, some of the key milestones that we have made, I think, over the last 25 years, I should start by saying that the Afrobarometer is regarded as the gold standard for doing surveys in Africa. And we are really proud of this recognition, and we jealously guard, I think, this so that we ensure that we maintain these very high standards by making sure we are working with the organizations that have the highest capacity. And I'm pleased that over the years, again, the capacity for doing research on this continent has grown so much that I remember my early years in Afrobarometer, I had to travel quite a lot around the continent just to provide technical support to different organizations in different countries on doing surveys. But since then, I think my travel schedule, thankfully, has gotten lighter and lighter, because the capacity of our partner organizations has gone up, that they don't only do Afrobarometer surveys, but they are also trusted and recognized for their expertise, and that they do a whole range of other surveys, building, I think, on their experience with Afrobarometer. In 2004, we were given the Best Data Set Award by the American Political Science Association, and we've also been, ranked consistently in the top 10 of the best institutional collaborations involving 2 or more think tanks. So That's one of our milestones. I think the other milestone that I also wanted to highlight, which I touched on very briefly, I think when I was showing the visual map of where we are working as Afrobarometer. We do surveys in rounds. Usually these rounds take about 2 years, give or take. That also do allow for time for analysis of our results. We have done, as I already reported, more than 259 surveys in 9 rounds of data collection. We have just started our 10th round of data collection in last month, and we hope to finish the 10th round of surveys by the end of the year, or at least early 2025. Altogether, we have done more than 388,000 interviews and still counting, and also in more than 100 survey languages. Earlier this morning, I was just looking at our round 9 surveys, which we did in 39 countries, and I noted that we actually used 124 languages in that survey round alone. And usually there are questions that we consistently track over time, and also, of course, we also respond to new and emerging issues by bringing in new question modules. We are also very proud that the Afrobarometer is an African-owned and managed network with our head offices in Accra, in Ghana, and again, as I said, we have really provided, I think, this platform where ordinary citizens can give us, can air out their voices, and then we take them on and amplify them to the policymakers. I think one of the most humbling experiences in the work that we do as Afrobarometer is that we go to many corners of the continent, many corners of countries where maybe no one has ever bothered to go and ask people their voices. And while I'm aware that other parts of the world, there's always a challenge of time, that survey respondents just don't have enough time to answer questions, and you experience high refusal rates. In Afrobarometer, that's not the case. Our questionnaires tend to be very long, but we find that respondents really are very willing to sit down for sometimes even exceeding an hour just to tell us, I think, what they think, not only about the issues that we wanted to ask them on, but also issues that they just wanted to have someone to discuss with. So we are very proud, and also we are very proud of being an independent, evidence-based check on other data sources. That even checking on as an independent check on some government data. So, for example, we do ask a question on what do people think should be the most important problem that governments should be prioritizing, and usually we find sometimes that there's a disconnect between what ordinary African citizens want their governments to prioritize versus what their governments are prioritizing. So we've also proved in this journey that public opinion research can be ably done, conducted using the same high international standards and methodologies, even in contexts that are fragile, some post-conflict societies, as well as some closed political environments on the continent. We have, as I already said, published hundreds of briefings and articles, working papers, journal articles, ourselves as Afrobarometer, but others that have also used our data. We have really such an expansive presence on social media, and also over the years I've published 2 books, and we hope to increase the number of book publications. But demonstrating our commitment to capacity building, we also have summer schools. We usually run 2 summer schools, one that is run in English, another one in French, and these are usually offered on an annual basis as a way of, again, contributing to the building of capacity to do surveys and also to analyze survey data on the continent. We conduct several university outreaches. We hold training sessions for media, for civil society, and also provide opportunities for Afrobarometer staff to attend various capacity building workshops, including fellowships. The data from Afrobarometer is also used in a number of global governance indicators, and I put on the screen there just a few, including USAID, UNDP, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, World Bank Group, Transparency International, as well as the Economics Intelligence Unit, who use this data really to develop their own their indices. In terms of moving on to looking at the issue of Afrobarometer data as a resource for policy making, I think policymakers are constantly asking the question, what do people think and what do they want? Usually, they don't have the resources to go and collect this data themselves. So as Afrobarometer, I think we do provide this platform where policymakers can and do really benefit from the data that we collect by getting, I think, answers to these questions. And usually the go-to resource for them is the Afrobarometer. As I already said, I think this does provide independent reality check on official reports and the claims. For example, one of our signature products is what we call the Afrobarometer Lived Poverty Index. This measures experience of deprivation of basic necessities, regardless of macroeconomic indicators. And sometimes what we have found is that the Lived Poverty Index really does show that there are countries that are performing poorly in terms of the experience of deprivation, even if in monetary terms they are doing very well. A good example, for instance, is South Africa, where we have seen, I think, over the years, lived poverty to be on the increase, despite, I think, the economic gains that that country has made. So this just goes to show that sometimes I think we need to go beyond the traditional measures of development, like economic growth, economic performance, to also look beyond that and look at this kind of measures. We're not claiming that this is a substitute, but we believe that it offers an important complement to the existing macroeconomic indicators of development and poverty. We have, we do also measure issues to do that compare quality and the quantity of supply. So, for example, access to electricity. Do people on the African continent have access to electricity? And then on the other hand, we ask questions on reliability. How available is that electricity? And sometimes what we find is that a lot of people are connected to electricity, but that electricity is so unreliable and rarely available. We have, I think, questions that look at what demand and supply of democracy and other democratic institutions. Do people want democracy on the African continent? And the answer to that question is usually a resounding yes. A lot of our citizens want democracy, but then they complain about its supply, that on the supply side, I think there are serious problems. Understanding of citizen priorities, I think I already alluded to this. What are the most important problems that are facing their countries that governments should be addressing? So these are just some of the questions. We also have questions on emerging issues, as I said, on migration, for example. And I think this is really quite an important issue, because we find from our surveys that while about 1/3 of African citizens have considered migrating from their countries, but most usually are looking just for a job and a way out of poverty, and that the majority of them are actually looking at other African countries other than Europe or North America. So they're just looking at some of the countries on the continent that have much stronger and better economies to migrate to. So a lot of the immigration that we see on the continent is actually within the continent rather than outside of the continent. We ask questions on climate change, which has affected and impacted a lot of citizens on a lot of communities on the continent. But we find that there are countries where most, like in Tanzania, where most farmers have never even heard of the word climate change, and that obviously creates an important gap that needs to be addressed if we can expect ordinary citizens to also have a role to play in mitigating the effects of climate change. It's also possible to disaggregate our data. I'm sure like most of the members of WAPO can do, by country, by region, gender, rural, urban, education, age groups, among other categories, demographic categories that can again create, opportunities for better targeting of intervention, and also, of course, using really the data to secure a footing for action. One of the challenges that a lot of African countries have been facing are presidents who say that they are so popular that they needed to stay in office indefinitely. But when we ask a lot of citizens on the continent, we actually find that 75% of these African citizens actually want their presidents to be limited to serve a maximum of 2 terms. Of course, that doesn't mean that they are happy with the performance of the presidents and the governments, but at least they do want, I think, that opportunity to have a say on who governs them. I'll turn now, I think, to the next session, which is looking at some of the challenges that we encounter as Afrobarometer. Needless to say, I think doing surveys, and especially face-to-face surveys, because that is really our modus operandi, where we do our surveys really face-to-face. And on a continent as diverse as ours, it means navigating across some of the most difficult terrain and infrastructure. We have mountainous areas, mountainous countries like Lesotho that are only areas of the country that are only accessible by foot. I recall some years back I was in Madagascar, and we traveled out with a team of a survey team to a place where there was really no road. The road ended, and then to get to the enumeration area that we wanted to get, it would take 2 days of walking on foot to get to that enumeration area, and obviously another 2 days back. Of course, some of our enumerators will complain, but our approach as Afrobarometer is always that if there are citizens of a country residing in a particular location that we have selected in our sampling, then we have to get to them. Of course, this also means navigating, deserts, mountains, swamps, marshes, islands that sometimes are just so difficult to access. We are also impacted by extreme weather that makes roads sometimes impassable. I have recollections of some colleagues of mine that some years back had to build their own bridges on a road in Zambia because the bridge that had existed before was washed away. Electricity and especially limited electricity, as well as erratic availability, also presents a challenge, another infrastructural challenge, especially when we are using tablets and the teams have to use the internet to sync the data. These are just some of the challenges that we have to face. We of course tried to mitigate some of this, providing battery backup to teams, adjusting, I think, the team composition, especially where teams have to travel on foot on longer distances. But we also find that the teams themselves have been really pretty innovative in finding solutions, as I said, including, I think, building bridges. Another challenge is, relates to doing surveys in countries that are sometimes autocratic, post-authoritarian as well as post-conflict societies. As I said, as a general rule, we will not go into a country if we feel that ordinary citizens will not be able to speak out their voices. So we do, from our experience, we found that there are countries that are autocratic, but the citizens are free enough to tell us that, yes, we live under an authoritarian regime, and we are not a democracy, and so on and so forth. So we will work in countries like that. But of course, this does pose some challenges where respondents sometimes are very suspicious regarding interviewer motives. Sometimes we are viewed as government agents, and that might also mean that their own responses to some of the questions that we ask are guarded because they worry in terms of who and how that data is going to be used. Of course, we do go to great lengths to reassure our respondents that we are truly independent, and that there's just no way that anyone would single out their responses from the responses the data that we collect at a national level. But we also find that while people are sometimes open to answering some questions, but when it comes to politically sensitive questions, I think there's a tendency to be very guarded and for fear, especially of negative reprisals. And we are constantly on the lookout for this, and that when we feel that we are not really getting true views, true perceptions of citizens in some of our countries, we've actually paused surveys and say we will not proceed with the surveys in those countries until such a time when we feel that people will be free enough to speak. There are, of course, also safety and security challenges, both physical and as well as political, for Afrobarometer, our partners that we work with, and the field workers. We've had cases, for instance, in Zimbabwe several years back when some of our field workers were arrested and basically incarcerated for more than a week or so. And we've faced similar challenges in countries like Mozambique, in Tanzania, among others. And indeed, in Burundi, our former national investigator, when we released the results that he suggested that majority of Burundians wanted their president to be limited to serving a maximum of 2 terms, he was really harassed and threatened to the point that he had to flee and sadly lived the rest of his life in exile, and unfortunately he ended up dying also in exile. We've had challenges with our researchers from Tunisia who were assisting us in Algeria, arrested and placed on house arrest for almost a year, really. So these are just some of the challenges that we encounter, but we are again proud that we work with the teams that are very proud to be part of this journey. The other challenge that we constantly face are also political uncertainty as well as unpredictability. We've had cases where we've had a military coup in Burkina Faso, for example, in the middle of our survey. So then we had to make adjustments to the survey. We have unpredictable political leaders and political decisions. You make plans to fill the survey, for example, in Senegal, and then the president decides to cancel presidential elections. That basically throws spanners into our preparatory work. We've had cases of civil conflicts in Mali, in the Sahel region, broadly speaking, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ethiopia, that have again impacted our ability to reach out to all corners of the country. So much that the data that we've been able to collect has not been truly representative of the countries as a whole. And these obviously, all these have impacts on the survey timing as well as what we can include in our questionnaires, as well as the security of our field teams. We also face challenges in terms of the people that we are talking to. And this is actually part of the reason why we also mostly do face-to-face surveys, unlike other parts of the world where surveys are being done either on, online web surveys or using telephone surveys. But we are dealing with a continent that has a lot of variation in terms of literacy levels. So we, quite a number of our survey respondents are illiterate, and we cannot then we cannot employ self-administration of surveys online, or indeed, on using mobile phones, or even pen and paper. And I think, this group of people also tends to be very suspicious with strangers who seek you to interview them, especially given that, most of these people have basically been abandoned by governments. So when we send our interviewers to ask them, they are naturally, suspicious, and we have to go to a great length of time to reassure them. Of course, the literacy levels also create challenges in understanding questions, especially those that use, use scales. I remember some years back, we wanted to have questions that would ask people to rate, say their government, the level of democracy in their country on a scale of 1 to 10. It sounds easy to ask these questions to people who are literate, but you ask someone who is illiterate to answer that kind of question, it just proved so difficult that we had to abandon that use of numerical scales. I added here the issue of languages, and many languages that we have to deal with. Not only are we dealing, with so many languages, because we have to interview people, our respondents, in a language of their choice that they are comfortable with, which usually means we translate our questionnaires into languages that are spoken by at least 5% of the population of any given country. But this does result in quite a lot of work, and also ensuring that we are not losing much in the translation. We have languages that are also not written. They are widely spoken, but there are no scripts that can be used. And this is quite really a huge problem for us in terms of administration of surveys and how we deal with that. Of course, we try and train our enumerators in such cases, from whether we are using French or English or Portuguese or Arabic, to say, okay, this is how let's all agree on a common language that we are going to use, the common way we are going to use in these languages. But of course, that limits our ability to monitor what the enumerators get to do at the end of the day. But apart from that, we also have another unique problem on the African continent, in that there are a lot of local languages that are even written, but they are not being taught in schools. So we have, a large section of enumerators that we engage, that they are highly educated, most of them up to university level, but they are not able to read their own local languages, even though they can speak them. So even if you translate, you give them a translation, they are not able to read the language, even if they use it. So that's really, one other challenge that we face. And then I'm sure the issue of COVID and these natural disasters is one that is common to all WAPO members. I recall, I think 2-3 years ago, I gave another presentation where WAPO and the Global Barometers team were reflecting on doing surveys during COVID-19. And I think this is a challenge that that also impacted our ability to work. Actually, when COVID-19 struck, we were right in the middle of doing our around 80 surveys, and of course, COVID-19, as we all know, took such a huge toll in the dissemination activities and our ability to meet policymakers in a way that could have achieved our goal for amplifying citizen voices. But like I'm sure most of you, and I would also would want to learn from you, we had to make adjustments. We actually brought in a special module on COVID-19 where we looked at the impact of the pandemic, how citizens, how citizens evaluate government's responses, but also on general questions um, on say vaccination uptake. I have to say personally, I think in Malawi, where I am based and I'm speaking from now, because of the work that we did, we managed to convince government to consider social science data in their fight against COVID-19, because for the most part, COVID was just being looked at as a purely medical issue, when actually, in actual fact, there were a lot of social dimensions to it that without appreciating those social dimensions, the fight against COVID-19 was not going to be purely successful. Of course, we had to innovate in terms of introducing systems that enabled us to work remotely. And we also have started to pilot the use of mobile phones to collect data. And I'll come back, I think, to this as part of our innovations, because as again, given, I think, the premise that I started with, we are a continent that has huge variations. We have countries that have almost 100% mobile phone coverage, and then we have countries that actually mobile phone coverage and ownership is below 50%. So there's always a variation in terms of how we can improve. We can adapt and adjust to some of these challenges. Last but one, I think, challenge is the issue of funding. Of course, we have really been privileged to be supported by a consortium of funders over the years that have included, the British Department for International Development, the Swedish International Development Agency, the United States Agency for International Development, the World Bank, Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and philanthropic foundations, including the World Bank, Urate Foundation, among many of organizations that have been very generous enough to support the work that we do. The European Union are in there, and I know the Japanese International Cooperation Agency that have at one point or another, funded the work that we do. But of course, we do face a challenge that, again, largely due to changing priorities. Some countries, aid agencies that used to constitute our core donors are no longer able to provide the funding that we can benefit from. So they include, the Foreign and Commonwealth, Development Office, the Canadian International Development Agency, DANIDA, among others that are no longer, available to support the work that we do. I think the funding, again, I'm sure a lot of the members of WAPOR also face this challenge. But in our case, it's because we strive to make Afrobarometer data a public resource. So this issue of funding really is really critical, so much that in actually 2016, we faced a huge financial crunch that we had to plan for scaling it down dramatically our country coverage. Fortunately, things did pick up, but this still remains quite an area that threatens, I think, the work that we do. And the last challenge that I wanted to also emphasize is the issue of data usage. I think I will preface this by saying that while there's been a lot of uptake of your Afrobarometer data outside Africa, we find that there's been a bit of resistance to accepting public attitude data, especially when the findings are deemed unflattering or politically unfavorable. And this also goes, I think, to even some resistance to taking up this data among even the academic faculty and the students on the African continent. And partly it's not just because people are resistant, but sometimes it's because people just don't have the training, some of the training, especially in the social sciences, has not really focused much in terms of quantitative data analysis. And of course, we always constantly face objections on methodology. It's kind of very common to hear people say you cannot really tell us what a whole country thinks just based on 1,200 survey respondents. It might sound laughable, but it is very common. I remember some years back in a country that I want to mention where people are saying, you should have sampled at least 3 million people if you wanted to, in a country of 18 million people. Say no, you should have as a minimum you should have spoken to 3 million people. Suffice to say that, even if we had the resources to do that, or I don't think it would have even the time to do so. So this understanding of the logic of sampling is something that is a problem for people to grasp. Although I should say, increasingly, I think there is a greater understanding. We constantly face accusations of political bias, not just bias, but I should say political bias, especially on governance issues that people are not happy with. But again, we find that there is also, as more and more people get to understand this work, I think I have a particular case example of Uganda, where before, I think, one of the elections, the recent elections, there was, I think, an expectation that the president would possibly lose. A long-term serving president would lose an election. And when our survey findings showed that actually his support was pretty steady, we were accused by especially members of opposition political parties, as well as civil society and human rights activists, of being biased in favor of government. And then a year later, when we did another follow-up survey in the same country, Uganda, and then majorities of Ugandans were complaining that their country was headed in the wrong direction. Then the government were blasting us for, again, being biased against them. And then a journalist from one of the leading papers in Uganda wrote an op-ed basically responding to those accusations that, look, when these people were being accused of being biased because they had found results that were pleasing to you guys in government, you welcomed that. So you want us to believe you that now they have switched. If anything, the fact that they can give us these different pictures goes a long way to demonstrating their independence. We also face challenges of communicating findings in ways that can help stakeholders to make maximum use of this data and to take it up. And also, I think, a capacity of our news organizations, civil society organizations, to analyze and use data. But as I said already, we are working as Afrobarometer towards building capacity of media, civil society organizations to be able to take up this data. I will highlight, as a way of concluding, some of the transitions and adjustments that we've made over the years. One, we initially, when we started the work we did for the first 12 or 15 years, actually, we were only using pen and paper interviewing. Since really around 2014, we have shifted completely to collecting data on tablets. And I'm pleased to say this has been, again, quite an eye-opener and a capacity builder for a lot of the organizations we work with. In Zimbabwe, for example, the partner organizations that we used to work with had so much experience, but we are mostly using pen and paper interviewing. And we are pretty hesitant when we were making the transition to electronic data capture. But after they got to use it just one round, they said they will never go back to pen and paper again. Even if some organization or client came to them to say, can you do some work for us? They just felt that the benefits of electronic data capture far outweighed those of using pen and paper. But there was also another advantage of pen and electronic data capture, because I recall in Nigeria, for example, where there are some militants very active in some parts of Nigeria, there's always a suspicion when they would see field teams with large piles of paper to go and interview people. Whereas on a tablet, you're not carrying a lot of luggage with you, and you minimize the issues of suspicion. We have, of course, the electronic data capture has also enabled us, I think, to go back and look at geocoding of our data. We have, as I already said, since COVID-19, been experimenting with telephone service, but we've been very deliberative on this. So our approach so far has been to run pilot cases where we've run telephone surveys alongside face-to-face surveys so that we can test if there are any mod effects to telephone surveys, or to see indeed if there's anything that we lose, especially given as the variation in mobile phone ownership that I highlighted. We are also, from this year, we will be experimenting with interviewing 16 and 17-year-olds, because all our surveys until now have mostly been with the people aged 18 and above. We are employing geofencing as a tool for quality control. So we hope to start this year, where then we would also, it would mean that the enumerators do not stray from the enumerators that, the areas that they have been assigned. Of course, we have already used, I think, GPS, location to even monitor the work of our teams, because we've had a few cases where, like I remember last year, we had to deal with a case where a team was reporting that they went to do surveys in an area that was far from where they were. So when we checked, they were actually about 300 kilometers away from where they said they were working in. So we found really this to be very, very useful. We are also exploring alternative sampling methods, and I want to hear members of WAPO here how they are addressing the issue of sampling, because we do depend on the census data, but we find that increasingly a lot of census data are outdated, but that this should not necessarily be a disqualifier for us to do surveys in countries. Like, for example, I can mention the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that we have long had an interest to work in, but their last census was done in 1975, almost 50 years ago, 49 years ago. I don't know, 49, yeah, close to 49 years ago. So how can we draw samples in countries like those where we don't have reliable census data? I'm aware that there are quite a lot of innovations in this area that we could also benefit from. We are constantly building our capacity, as well as investing in a new core of upcoming researchers. So our founders have since transited out of Afrobarometer, and we have a new core team. But even that new core team, I was talking to my colleague this morning, that are we the younger face of Afrobarometer? And she reminded me that no, we no longer are. We are also we are the kind of getting into to the end of our time in Afrobarometer, and we are happy to be training people that can also succeed us and building their capacity over time. So in conclusion, we have proven as Afrobarometer in our 25 years that yes, there are so many challenges on the continent, but despite this, it is still possible to do high quality public opinion surveys on this continent that we live in and we love dearly. And that indeed the challenges also we see them as an opportunity, that we do provide a resource because it is challenging. We know and are aware that a lot of people are unable to do the work we do. So we do this work and we make the data available as a public good, and we continue to innovate and find ways of ensuring that voices of ordinary Africans are heard and continue to be reflected in national policies. So I will stop here, and then we can move, I guess, to the question and comment section. We have our website there, and you can go and find out data on all the countries that we are working in, and you can download all the publications, Afrobarometer publications, and even do the online data analysis on our webpage. And if you also wanted to know the people and the faces behind Afrobarometer, you can get the whole lot of information on our webpage. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to take questions. But as I said, I know there are colleagues on the call from Afrobarometer that can also help me to answer and address some of the questions. Thank you.
Well, Professor Boniface Dulani, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation. I see that Ali has a hand and has some questions. So Ali?
Yes, thank you very much. There are some issues I would like to elaborate on, but I have first a question. Dr. Dulani, this is about the regulations focusing in Francophone Africa, West Africa, and also we could add also Central Africa. So the regulation of survey, opinion poll, election poll does not exist, if not forbidden, for example, for election polls. So I see that we researchers from the regions and bodies such as WAPOR, ISOMA, we may advocate to put in place the regulation in favor of practice of opinion poll, publication of a result, and development in the sector. Now, the question is, how have you faced this regulation situation in Francophone countries of West Africa? Also in, we could include Central African countries, Francophone Central African countries. How have you faced this problem of regulation? If you want, I can explain a bit more. If you go to Senegal, the regulation does not exist. How we can work with government and we can work with academics to promote polls in this environment.
Thank you for that. I assume we will take a couple of questions and then we can address them together.
Now, the other two one are not actually questions. I wanted to elaborate a bit on the 2.11 issues you mentioned and the implication of that issue. You spoke about illiterate. You say that in our regions, most of the people are not literate. So, for instance, you take Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, you have more than 50% of the population living in rural areas. And so therefore, things like a mobile phone, online phone, CATI, web, SMS survey, doesn't make big there. So now we're happy that we have clients, when we speak to them about CAPI, I think they are ready to follow us. Because if we want to capture the reality, if we want to interview the populations, and 50% are illiterate, some of the techniques don't work at all. Now, there is another implication of the fact that most of the people are illiterate. You know, some international issues like policies, superpowers, countries, World Bank, some of these issues don't mean a lot to part of the population who lives in the rural areas. Even when we speak about politics, the local people, some have opinion, care of the leaders who will, brief them will convince them of what are the choices that they should make. So these are some of the things that we live with. And I'm happy that Professor Dulani also spoke on them. Thanks for the moment.
Thank you. I see two other hands.
Yeah,
I don't know whether I responded to that question first, or we should take the hands first.
And we also have some questions in the Q&A.
In the chat. Yes.
So I wonder.
So maybe let me take that question and the ones that are in the Q&A, and then we can give a chance to those who have their hands. If that's the way you would want to suggest we proceed.
Excellent. That's a great idea.
Okay. So thank you so much. I think for the question on the pre-election, pre-election surveys. I do agree with the question that a lot of countries, we don't have a tradition of pre-election studies and election polling. And usually this is why a lot of political parties and political leaders, always claim that they will win an election, and that when an election is lost, the usual refrain is to say the election was stolen from me, even though there is really no basis for that. So how do we navigate around that? Of course, as Afrobarometer, even in our standard service, we do have a lot of questions on elections, looking at electoral participation in terms of voting, in terms of assessment of the quality of elections, but also, how the extent to which elections enable voters to choose people who can reflect the views of ordinary citizens. So the efficacy of elections in other ways. So both the demand side, whether people really want elections as a way of choosing leaders, because there is an increasing perception that, democracy sometimes is failing us, so maybe we need to look at alternatives. And sometimes when we have the military coups, you mentioned Francophone West Africa. I mean, we have Niger, Mali, Burkina, Guinea, currently under military rule, and we did see a few people on the streets, celebrating when those military coups happened. But I think despite, the people that we see on the streets celebrating the military coups, we still find that, yes, people are dissatisfied with how democracy is performing, but there's still a lot of faith in democracy and in the ability of people to choose who their leaders are. A few weeks ago, when in Senegal, for example, President Sall, cancelled the elections, we looked at our data in Senegal, and clearly majorities of Senegalese do feel that they should still have a say in how they should be governed through popular elections. So we're not surprised to see the kind of pressure building up on the streets that eventually compelled, the president to go back on his decision, of course, with the courts also weighing in Senegal. So we believe that yes, there's a big role to play in terms of political opinion polling. How can we get around these issues? Of course, Afrobarometer, given our international stature, it helps, in having the kind of image that we have, and we have the relationships that we have built with the governments as well as the statistical agencies, so much that we find that there's really increasing willingness for us to work even in environments where local researchers might face challenges. But of course, we all have to work with the local researchers as well. I can only agree with you on the issue of literacy, that it's a big problem. But I think what is really important is that while web surveys, self-administered questionnaires could leave people out that are illiterate, our experience from Afrobarometer doing face-to-face surveys, and that's why we are still sticking to face-to-face surveys with that option of piloting and testing telephone surveys, is that people might be illiterate, but it does not mean that they don't have opinions on issues that affect them. And that's really the biggest advantage of the face-to-face approach, even though obviously relative to the other approaches, it is much more expensive. There is a question from Faith Rono asking about the quality assurance measures that we take, considering the many challenges that come with face-to-face interviews. Well, there are a lot of quality assurance checks. Each of our teams, it starts with the selection of the people who go and collect the data for us. We are very, very selective in who gets to work for us. Then there's also, of course, the training that is provided, extensive training with technical support from Afrobarometer. But as I also said, even during field work, we are constantly monitoring a food, the data returns, maybe not in real time, because sometimes people are working in places, as I already said, areas that have no network reception. But we have data officers that are dedicated to checking on the field returns on a daily basis, and they do communicate with the national investigators and the supervisors, even to the point of pinpointing enumerators that have, we are seeing some problems with their work. So we believe that, I think, with all this, I think we are able to identify challenges. I think, and this is where electronic data capture has helped us a lot, because I remember, in the past, we could only address this, after data cleaning, and then we would realize there are problems. In Zambia, I think in the early 2000s, we actually had to redo an entire survey because there were so many problems that were encountered. So inclusion of people aged below 18, I think, of course, the census data usually is disaggregated by individual age groups, so single age groups. So it's possible to do this. It's just the question of, I think, obtaining a consent, because, usually laws require that, for people who are underage, we have to obtain consent from their parents. So that's something that we are working on. We are only going to pilot this in 3 countries, I believe, in Ghana, in Kenya, and Senegal, where we will try and pilot interviewing 16 to 17-year-olds. But we believe that they do also have important things to say about how they are governed, and what role they can play in society. Levels the question from Caroline Roy on the level of openness of governments and companies to invest in conducting surveys. I think this is a big challenge, because surveys, as I'm sure colleagues from WAPOR would share, are not cheap, cheap exercises. It costs quite a lot to do surveys, and especially when it comes to face-to-face surveys. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because governments don't have resources for investing in this work, doesn't mean that they don't value this data. So that's why, as Afrobarometer, we make the effort to reach out to different donor organizations to continue to support the work we do. And we are truly grateful, because then we are able to make this data available, especially to governments, because that's really where we want the voices of African citizens to count. The experience of using phone surveys from Nedao Swahili, my apologies if I mispronounce your name. I think so far what we are finding is kind of mixed. I think in some cases we are finding that there's not a huge difference in what we find from telephone surveys versus face-to-face surveys. The main, of course, the limitation of telephone surveys is that we can only ask, so many questions in a telephone survey, whereas in a face-to-face survey, we are able to ask a variety of questions. But what we are hoping to do now as we move forward is to now, in countries that have more or less universal mobile phone coverage, then we can collect more data using mobile phones, using random digit dialing. But another approach we have used is actually, apart from random digit dialing, is that in the face-to-face surveys that we are conducting since COVID, we have been asking survey respondents if they would be willing to share telephone numbers that they can be reached at if we would want to do some follow-up interviews. So this might give us a kind of a panel option that could be done using the mobile approach, although thus far the experience is that even when we get mobile phone numbers, usually not all of them are accessible when we try to call them. And again, lastly, from Sophie, what kind of indicators we are looking for to identify situations where people are reluctant to respond candidly. So one, of course, the interviewers, we ask them to also make some observations, but we do even ask a question at the end of our surveys to say, who do you think sent us to do this interview? So even after we have reassured people we are independent, we are Afrobarometer, and the local partner organization we are working with, we still find that there are people towards the end that still think we are from government, or they think we are from civil society. The good thing is our findings also show that sometimes most of the time, this doesn't matter whether people think we are from government or not. I'll give you a good example for Zimbabwe. During the regime of the late President Robert Mugabe, we would get a lot of cases where people tell us that we think you are from government, but they will still tell us that the president is doing a bad job, government is doing a poor job and is corrupt, and that it is not democratic. So sometimes this doesn't necessarily mean that it stops people from speaking out what they truly think. Thank you.
There is a question in the chat I just wanted to bring up. Daniel Montevallo asks, in household selection, how do you select respondents in the household?
Okay, thank you. I've seen that question, Daniel. Yeah, another excellent question. So, as I said, I mean, we select enumeration areas, I mean, randomly, and all the process that goes with that. When we get to the enumeration area, we have, as I said, 4 interviewers, and usually the census data will also tell us the population, the number of households in each enumeration area. So if let's say there are 100 households, and we know, let me make my maths not too complicated for myself. Let's say there are 80 households in an enumeration area, then the teams will split, and each one of them will have they will count 10 households before they select the next household. So that again, each household should have an equal chance of being selected. At the household level, we will already have made a determination whether we are going to interview a female or a male. So if it's a male, we will collect data on the number of adults in the household, and then we will then look at the gender that we are looking at. So if you see male, and there are, let's say, 5 males in that household, then we will randomly select that using, I think, programming on the tablets. In the past, we used to have a pack of cards to select a respondent, but we have moved on now, and we are now using the tablets to randomly select an individual from the household. If that individual is not available, then we will book an appointment to come back and interview them at a later time if they will be back in the day. If they are not going to be back in the day, then we will substitute the household, not the respondent in the household. Will substitute that household, and we will do the work pattern and get to the next household, and then select a respondent from there. I hope that answers the question, Daniel. Thank you so much for your positive feedback.
Wonder if I might ask one little follow-up on that. In cases where you're dealing with large households, and also in cases where maybe family is a very important structure and people have never seen a survey before, how do you deal with keeping an interview private, or will you conduct it in the presence of other people who might be interested in going on, seeing what's going on, or how do you deal with that?
Thank you. Again, excellent question. It is indeed a challenge to make it to convince people that we only want to select one person. And usually, I think it helps that during the selection process, we are mostly dealing with the head of the household up to the point where we are selecting the respondent. In some cases, we even ask them to say, okay, press this button so that we can the tablet can help us to select the person that we are going to interview. This gives them a lot of confidence in knowing that we didn't come with a preconceived selections, because some people think, yeah, you already knew who you wanted to speak to. And we do train our enumerators to insist that interviews should be done in a private space. But while that is usually achieved, in some rare cases it is not. And then the enumerator is required to record that at the end of the interview so that we can have data to know, if there were any people in the vicinity, not just present during the interview, but even within a vicinity, because we know that this would also impact on the respondents. So, for example, if we are asking a question that, let's say, do you belong to a political party, and which political party is that? If maybe we are interviewing, a daughter and their father is there who happens to go to hold a position in a particular political party, if they are there in the vicinity and they can overhear, then of course they might mention, the respondent might just mention the party that the father belongs to, even if they support another party. We have tried, of course, to do some list experiment, some experiments to, in some rare cases, especially pre-election surveys, to try and ask different questions to different sets of people at the end, that can also try and address questions on whether we think people have had to mince the truth here and there. But I think actually one challenge also is that, as I said, a lot of people are in situations where no one has ever asked them their views. So one challenge we constantly face is, once we started to ask people, everyone wants to be interviewed. And when you are skipping some households using that household selection pattern, there are some households that will insist that, no, you can't skip my house. You also have to come to our house and interview someone from there. Of course, the enumerators will try and explain as much as they can, but I do know of cases where enumerators have had to do some just made up interviews just to appease people who think that we might have, some ulterior motives by not selecting someone from their household.
Excellent. We have two more. There are a couple of hands I see, and there are also two more in the chat. One of the questions in the chat asks about the Kenya survey. Interviews identifies respondents' race. Is that a respondent selection, or is that something else? Well, so we do one of the things that Professor Dulani mentioned were the technological challenges of some of these settings. And I know in the pre-conference or the pre-webinar warm-up, we at least once lost him as well. So I wonder if we wait a moment to see if he joins, but if not, we are nearing the end of our time. And I'm sorry we're not able to get to this final 4 or 5 questions. But perhaps the best thing to do is to wait for another 30 seconds or a minute or so. Here he comes.
My apologies, my connection, it dropped there for a moment, but I'm back. So sorry about that.
So, Bonnie, we had a question about the race of the respondent in Kenya, which apparently is included in the data set. Is that self-reported or measured by interviewers or something else?
Okay. So the race of respondent is recorded by the enumerator, not the respondent. But from the current round of surveys that has just launched this year, we have dropped that question where an enumerator reports the respondent of, the race of the respondent. We will be asking that question in only 2 countries where the racial breakdown is always considered to be critical, and that's namely South Africa and Namibia. But even in that case, the new approach is that we will ask the respondents to tell us what their race is on their own. But up until so, the data that is there now, it's the enumerator who's recording the respondent race.
And we have a question from Patrice Gazir, who's very interested in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, that you referred to, because we hope there might be a way out of the issue where the census is very, very, very old, and they need to be included in this round of data collection. How do you think about that? Thank you, Patrice.
Thank you, Patrice. I'll be very happy to take up this conversation with you and other colleagues in the DRC. We'll be very happy to discuss, because I think we've explored a number of options, including the possibility maybe of doing an urban survey, because we know that a large proportion of the population in the DRC is concentrated in the major urban centers. But we'll be happy again if there are opportunities for us to do the surveys. I think we've been discussing with some colleagues. This is why also I was talking about looking at alternative sampling methods that we can employ to conduct a survey in a country like the DRC, because we do know it is a big and important country on the continent. So, Patrice, maybe if you could reach out and we can have that conversation offline as well, because we in Afrobarometer will be equally happy to engage in the DRC.
So I see we have a hand from Ruby Arana. Ruby? Hello, so we also have in the chat a question about translating from multilingual settings, and it's really this issue that you have a multitude of languages. Sometimes the interviewers don't read the written version of the language. Do you allow them to translate the questionnaire to the local languages on the fly during the interview at their discretion, or is that on demand? And are there specific training instructions to interviewers in these situations for the live translations?
Thank you for that. I see there are some more hands on the board. But to answer the question on the translations, because we want every respondent to hear the same question, and we are always very, I don't know what the right word is, but we do not accept on the spot translations, because then we are leaving it in the hands of the enumerator to decide how they translate a question. So before you know it, then we are basically asking different questions. So we do request our enumerators to indicate the language that they use during the interview. They indicate that at the end of the survey, and usually that has to be a language that we had signed off during the translations, because we want to, so the translation process goes through a lot of protocols, forward translation and back translation, and then a reconciliation between the back translators and the forward translators to make sure there is a consensus that we are indeed asking the right thing. So if the enumerators started to ask questions in different languages, that what we will advise enumerators is, if they don't speak a particular language and there's a member of the team that speaks that language, the respondent's language, and we have a translation for that, then they can invite the enumerator that has those language skills, and then that language would already be on their tablet, so they can just switch to that language. But on the spot translations, we do not allow them.
Thank you very much. We've got about 5 more minutes. Angela Mambito?
Thank you very much. Greetings from Nairobi, and very useful information from Afrobarometer. I just wanted to say that everything that has been discussed thus far really resonates, but also to take the opportunity, because Ali and I myself belong to WAPOR Sub-Saharan Africa chapter, to just sensitize and perhaps communicate that we will be having a regional conference in April, and it is my sincere hope that the Afrobarometer team led by Dr. Dulani will be able to participate quite comprehensively, because all the things that he has mentioned in this very useful discussion today are encompassed in the 20 broad themes that we will be having. So Daktari, as we would call you if you are in Nairobi or if you are in Kenya, please reach out to your networks. We want to have robust engagements on all the issues you have discussed on, regarding cross-national sampling and opinion polling and surveys on a platform that really, would affect the continent at large. Thank you very much for the useful discussion. Ali, I hope I have done you justice by taking the opportunity to sensitize the team here. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you for the reminder. Yes, thank you for the reminder for all of us that this will be the inaugural conference of the Sub-Saharan Africa chapter of WAPOR. One of the wonderful things of WAPOR is that we do have regional chapters, and the Sub-Saharan Africa one is growing and lively. I see we've got room for maybe one more question. Georgino Pizzolito. Hello? Georgina? Well, let me, in conclusion, here we have something. It was about the questionnaires. So I believe we have gotten to that. And as we have run out of time, let me just give a great thanks to Ali Nguesson for organizing this, but especially to Professor Dulani, who has just been good enough and generous enough to share his wonderful expertise in this wonderful project for us. So really thank you from all of WAPOR for doing that. For our guests, we would like to remind you, of course, of the WAPOR SSA Sub-Saharan Africa Conference, the inaugural one in Nairobi next month. And would also like to remind you that at the end of July and beginning of August, we will be meeting in Seoul, Korea for our annual international conference. So we hope to see all of you there, hope to see many of you, all of you really, and I'm sorry, it is not in Nairobi, it is in Mombasa. Yes, Mombasa. My apologies, but to see you in Kenya. And thank you very much for joining us. We will have a recording of this available within a couple of days, along with the slides shared on the WAPOR site on our YouTube channel. And we will be sending anyone who is registered for this a link. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much once again for having us. And we look forward to more engagement with WAPOR, and of course, we'll take up the invite to Nairobi. I see my colleague Daniel Ideli from our Nairobi office has already, said he will be reaching out to Angela and the WAPOR team. We look forward to working with you again. And once again, my pleasure for having me this afternoon, this morning. Thank you.